Alright, welcome back to the second video looking at this book, Trainwrecks by Robert C. Reed. In the first video we looked at boiler explosions, which as far as the human cost, mostly affected the engineers and conductors. The accidents we're going to look at here mostly affect passengers and cargo. We can speculate the weather might play a role, but for the most part, I would say human error is mainly to blame here. From what I've read, the signalmen play a large role in accidents with trains underway. I find it curious that many trains did not have a large amount of time between them on the same track, and this timing could relate back to dispatcher errors. I was reading that it was as few as 5 minutes behind each other, which seems insane. Now, having a train stall out for whatever reason was a major cause for concern for a passenger. If your train stopped on the tracks, you got off as soon as you could. Just thinking about another train coming full speed behind you would be terrifying. Then imagine this happening in pitch black darkness. You might not hear anything until the very last moment. Now, besides these signalmen running down the track to warn an oncoming train of the stall, they also use what's called train torpedoes, which I'll cover probably in another shorter video. Now, when a train hits another train from behind, it can result in what's called a telescoping accident. And what this means is the approaching car slides into the stalled car like a piston into a sleeve. Or you could think of a pirate's telescope that collapses in on itself when you close it for storage. So you could imagine that everything inside the sleeve car is destroyed, including the people. Now, the head-on collisions just caused massive damage, especially as the trains became heavier and traveled faster. Alright, so let's take a look at some of these photos. So, as we've said in the intro, telescoping is a type of railroad accident in which one car forces itself inside another car, like the tubes in a partially closed telescope. In such accidents, passengers were usually crushed to death from the force. This old colonial railroad engine has completely telescoped inside a wooden coach. The shell of the coach rests over the engine like a deadly masquerade mask. One of the most disastrous telescope accidents of all was one at Mud Run, Pennsylvania, October 10, 1888. 64 people on an excursion of the Total Abstinence Union were killed in the gruesome telescoping of these rickety Lehigh Valley Railroad carriages. The train had stopped briefly at Mud Run when it was ran from behind by a speeding express. Here we have a derailed locomotive that slashed deeply into this wooden car, leaving it a pile of worthless kindling. Telescoping of passenger cars, figuring as it did in almost all of the great wrecks, was premier among the horrors of travel. At Chatworth, Illinois, on August 10, 1887, a Toledo, Poria, and Western excursion bound for Niagara Falls fell through a small trestle. 9 coaches tumbled into a pile, and 82 passengers were killed in the dreadful telescope of the cars. And here we have another view of the splintered wreckage of coaches at the Chatworth wreck. Severe telescoping was typical in rear-end collisions. This one happened in February 27, 1917, at Mount Union, Pennsylvania, when a stalled Pennsylvania passenger train was struck from the rear by a fast-moving freight. 20 people were killed by the telescoping of the all-steel sleeping car Bellwood. This Long Island Railroad locomotive hit the rear of a stalled freight, smashing the wooden boxcar to pieces. This wreck took place at Bay Shore, Long Island on July 10, 1909. Another example of the vulnerability of steel cars to telescoping is this mangled coach of the Northern Pacific Railroad, which was crushed a third of its length in 1913 in Lakeview, Washington. This general view of the Corning, New York wreck shows the terrible carnage that can result from a rear-end collision. After the blizzard subsided, the people of Marlborough Junction, Massachusetts, looked out their window to find a milk train perched on top of a locomotive that was pushing a snowplow on the Clinton and Fitchburg branch of the New Haven Railroad. These engines struck each other so hard that the plow scooped up the milk train's engine and carried it onto her shoulders. This freak accident happened on February 4th, 1898. The Penny's Pennsylvania Limited was smacked from behind and pushed aside. Her cab was completely demolished by the impact. Such an accident cost the company thousands, but local schoolboys thought it all great fun. 5 passenger coaches were thrown off the tracks by the impact of this rear-end collision on the Pennsylvania Railroad near Pittsburgh. An injured passenger is shown being carried away from an overturned coach. There's not much left of these locomotives of the Maine Central after running into each other at Riverside, Maine in 1883. Both boilers burst, killing the crews and blowing the engines to pieces. The all-time sensational runaway wreck was the Washington, D.C. terminal disaster of 1953. Loaded with inauguration-bound passengers, the Penny's Crack Federal Express sped out of control, headed straight for a dead end, the capital's classic marble station. The express smashed through the station and into the main concourse, where the floor collapsed under the weight. Thankfully, no one was killed. This B&O locomotive went on a runaway rampage in the middle of Chillicothe, Ohio, tearing up a couple of new engines and several freight cars. These 2 big steamers rammed together during the night of March 28, 1916, at Lemon Springs, North Carolina. A triple wreck at Coneoh, Ohio, on March 27, 1953, killed 21 people when 2 passenger trains and a freight train of the New York Central collided. This New Haven locomotive lies helpless in a tidal swamp near Kingston, Rhode Island, after colliding with the wreck of a freight train whose boiler had exploded just minutes before. Since the crew of the freight train were killed in the explosion, no one could go ahead to flag the Cope Cotter. The accident happened on June 26, 1926. In a blinding snowstorm near Coburg, Indiana, in 1886, these double-heading B&O engines smacked into the rear of another train. The men at the rear of the tender are carrying a fireman who was killed. A rear-end collision at Tyrone, Pennsylvania, on July 30th, 1913, threw this Pennsylvania Railroad postal car diagonally across the track, the front end striking the station and coming to rest on the station platform. Because of its steel construction, most of the shock of the collision was absorbed by the platform and the vestibule of the cars. No passengers were killed. This Baltimore and Ohio Express car was wrecked in 1918 at Reduction, Pennsylvania, when a locomotive was derailed by a brake beam falling on the track. 2 men lost their lives by the telescoping of this wooden car. At 65 miles an hour, a Lackawanna Express crashed into the rear of a stalled excursion train near Corning's, New York, on July 4th, 1912. Killing 39 people. This picture shows a steel car lying on its side and stripped of its trucks after telescoping the wooden sleeping car Estonia, shown on the right. Scattered bedding, its mute evidence of the sudden terror of the collision.